Please be advised that this video contains sensitive content. This video is solely for educational and informational purposes. The courtroom fell into a hush. All eyes turned to the witness stand as Usher Raymond IV, global superstar, Grammy-winning artist, and childhood icon, took his seat. The weight in the room was palpable. This wasn't just testimony, it was a reckoning. 4 years, the music world buzzed with whispers about Sean Diddy Combs. Stories that slipped through the cracks of fame and fortune. Rumors dismissed as industry gossip. But now, in a federal courtroom packed with lawyers, press, and silent observers, Usher was about to make those whispers impossible to ignore. He spoke not just as a pop legend, but as a former child star, once 14 years old, sent to New York under Diddy's care. What was promised as mentorship became something else entirely, an environment of excess, exploitation, and silence. He called it Flavor Camp. It sounded like fun. It wasn't. Usher described champagne at breakfast, strangers roaming half-dressed, masked gatherings, and a confidentiality agreement at 16 that locked him into years of silence. His voice didn't tremble. It sharpened. He recalled journal entries he kept in secret, documenting encounters that blurred the lines between grooming and manipulation. When he refused to play along, opportunities vanished. So did people. This wasn't just about one man. Usher made that clear. It was about a system, one that preyed on ambition, demanded silence, and buried trauma beneath platinum records. And now, for the first time, one of its biggest stars was telling the truth. The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. The music industry wouldn't be either. Usher was just 14 when his mother sent him to New York, believing she was giving him the best chance to chase his dream. The plan, arranged by music executive L.A. Reid, sounded like every young artist's fantasy. One-on-one mentorship with Sean Diddy Combs, one of the biggest names in the industry. But what Usher stepped into was nothing like what had been promised. There were no vocal coaches. No songwriting workshops. No studio schedules. Instead, he woke up to champagne at breakfast. Strangers, grown adults, lounged around half-dressed. The air was thick with smoke, music, and something darker that Usher couldn't quite name back then. Diddy called it Flavor Camp. The name made it sound fun. Like summer camp for rising stars. But what it really was, Usher now says, was a front for something far more disturbing. There were no rules. No boundaries. And no protection for the teenage boy caught in the middle of it all. Looking back, Usher realizes what Flavor Camp truly represented. Not a launchpad for young talent, but a grooming ground. A place where power overshadowed guidance, and silence was the unspoken price of staying close to fame. At 14, he thought this was just how the industry worked. Now, he knows better. And he's finally ready to speak. Then came the Caribbean trip. Usher was 15. By all appearances, it should have been a dream getaway, sun, beaches, music, and powerful mentors. But what he experienced was something entirely different. The nights brought strange, ritual-like gatherings. People wore masks, their faces hidden, their intentions unclear. There were whispered conversations behind closed doors and late-night summons Usher didn't understand. He wasn't just confused, he was scared. Nothing about it felt professional. Nothing felt safe. And yet, no one else seemed alarmed. Around him, adults moved with a practiced ease, as if this was all just part of the culture, part of how the game worked. A year later, at 16, Usher was handed a thick envelope. Inside was a confidentiality agreement, pages of legal language, carefully crafted to keep him quiet. To bind his experiences in secrecy. He was told it was routine, part of protecting the business. But in truth, that piece of paper was a muzzle. It told him, in no uncertain terms, speak, and you lose everything. So he didn't. He stayed silent through the rise of his fame, through sold-out tours and chart-topping albums. But the memories from that island, those masked faces, those nights filled with confusion and fear, never left him. For decades, he carried them alone. Now, for the first time, he's telling the world what really happened. And with each word, that silence is beginning to break. What he couldn't say out loud, Usher wrote in his journal. It became his only safe place, pages filled with thoughts he couldn't risk speaking. Feelings he didn't yet know how to name. In one entry, dated 1997, he described a meeting arranged with supposed investors. On the surface, it was just business. But the setting was strange. The energy was off. The questions felt personal, invasive. Not about music, but about boundaries, about control. Usher was still a teenager, but something in his gut told him to say no. He declined whatever was being offered or implied. And from that moment on, things began to shift. Phone calls stopped being returned. Meetings were suddenly cancelled. Promises made just weeks before evaporated without explanation. It was like a quiet blacklisting. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear: you're not playing the game. The industry door that had once been wide open to him began to close, inch by inch. Not with a dramatic slam, but with deliberate silence. The people who once praised him vanished. The support system he thought he had, gone. He kept writing in that journal, trying to make sense of a world that punished him for protecting himself. And for years, those pages were the only place his truth lived. Now, standing in a courtroom, he no longer needs the journal to speak for him. He's finally saying it out loud. It wasn't just him. Usher told the court that, years later, he learned he hadn't been the only young artist drawn into Diddy's world under the guise of mentorship. Justin Bieber, another child star, another voice with promise, had also been invited to a version of what Diddy called Flavor Camp. The term still echoed with sickening familiarity. When Usher confronted Diddy about it, hoping for an explanation, what he got was a chilling response: "Same thing they did to me. It's how the game works." In that moment, everything became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't an isolated mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a cycle. A game, as Diddy described it, where the young and eager were lured in, tested, manipulated, and kept quiet. Where power masked as mentorship, and trauma was passed down like tradition. Kids weren't protégés. They were pawns. The unspoken rule was survival through silence. Speak up, and the machine would grind you down. Stay quiet, and maybe, just maybe, you'd make it through with your career intact. Usher saw the pattern. He saw his past replaying itself in someone else's life. And he realized that staying silent wouldn't protect anyone, not him, not Justin, not the ones who'd come next. That's when he knew it was time to speak. Not just for himself, but for every artist who'd been told that pain was just part of the price of success. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a system built on silence. And silence was no longer an option. And it went beyond the personal. Usher's testimony wasn't just about the emotional scars, it was about the business scars too. He brought forward contracts, thick with legal jargon and hidden clauses, built not to protect artists, but to trap them. He described pages designed to confuse, to control, to ensure that ownership, the true power in music, never belonged to the performer. He spoke of royalties, millions of dollars, vanishing without explanation. Payments delayed, reduced, or never made at all. Artists, some barely out of their teens, locked out of their own music, their own names, their own futures. In 2011, Usher tried to do something bold. He reached out to others, fellow performers who had been wronged in similar ways. He envisioned a private gathering, a coalition of voices finally demanding transparency and justice. A chance to stand together. But before they could even meet, someone tipped Diddy off. The meeting fell apart before it began. Some pulled out. Others disappeared. The fear was too real, too deeply rooted. Even among the successful, even among the stars, silence had become a survival tactic. What Usher had hoped would be a turning point became a bitter lesson. Fear, carefully cultivated over years, was stronger than outrage. But now, in court, with the world watching, that silence was cracking. The contracts, the missing royalties, the threats, they were finally part of the story. Not just whispered in green rooms, but spoken into the record. And Usher made it clear, the abuse wasn't only physical or emotional. It was financial. Systemic. Designed to make sure artists never truly owned the art they bled for. Then came the disappearance. In 2001, At the height of his fame, Usher had just released 8,701, a platinum album, chart-topping hits, a world ready to celebrate him. And then, he vanished. Fans thought it was a break. The industry said he was regrouping. But the truth was far more painful. He wasn't resting. He was surviving. Usher revealed that he checked into a mental health facility in California under an alias, away from cameras, away from expectations. Not as a superstar, but as a young man unraveling under the weight of secrets he couldn't share. He described panic attacks that came without warning. A hotel hallway could send him into a spiral, especially if it smelled like the candles Diddy used during his parties. Certain songs triggered flashbacks. Flashing lights. Crowds. Even something as simple as laughter could collapse him inward. The diagnosis was clear: PTSD. The trauma he'd buried for years had finally surfaced, and it demanded to be faced. It took 2 years of intensive therapy before he could sleep through the night without waking up in fear. 2 years before his body stopped flinching at the sound of certain beats. 2 years to begin healing from the wounds no one else could see. To the world, Usher never missed a step. But in reality, he was fighting a battle that almost broke him. And now, standing in court, he shared it not for sympathy, but to show just how deep the damage ran. Because trauma doesn't always end when the music stops. Sometimes, that's when it begins. This isn't just about one man, Usher said, his voice steady, his eyes scanning the courtroom. Because while the world may have focused on Diddy, Usher made it clear this was about more than one powerful figure. It was about an entire system. A system that didn't just allow abuse, it protected it. A system that rewarded those who stayed silent and crushed those who dared to resist. He described it as a machine, one that devoured talent and spat out obedience. It monetised silence, built careers on fear, and enforced loyalty with the threat of erasure. Speak up, and the machine would make sure your voice was never heard again. Usher told the court about one artist in particular. Someone brave enough to speak out. Someone who tried to break away, to reclaim his name and his music. Diddy's response: order the destruction of the artist's work, his masters, his videos, everything. And just like that, the artist disappeared. No tour. No social media. No music. He simply vanished from the public eye, as if he had never existed. And for everyone else watching from within the industry, the message was clear: speak up, and you'll be next. Usher paused after sharing that story, letting the weight of it settle. Because it wasn't just an anecdote, it was a warning, one that had haunted him for years. And now, in front of the world, he was done being haunted. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And truth, finally, was louder than fear. Why now? The question echoed through the courtroom, sharp and pointed. Usher didn't hesitate. He looked out, steady and composed, as if the weight of his answer had been carried for years. Because nobody would have believed me in 2001, he said, his voice clear. Puffy was untouchable. And I was just the kid with the voice. Back then, he was a rising star, still a teenager, with his future in the hands of those with more power, more influence. The industry was built to protect its own, especially someone as high-profile as Diddy. Speaking out then would have meant losing everything. So he stayed silent. Not out of choice, but out of survival. But now, things were different. Now, Usher continued, the world is listening. He let that sink in, his gaze unwavering. Now, silence isn't survival. It's complicity. The silence that had once been his shield was now a burden. A weight he could no longer bear. He knew that staying quiet had allowed the system to thrive, and he knew now that his voice could be the catalyst for change. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about breaking the silence for everyone who had been silenced before him. The power of truth was louder now. The world was listening, and Usher was no longer afraid to speak. He wasn't just telling his story. He was calling out the system that had allowed abuse to flourish in the shadows for far too long. He ended with a message not just to the court, but to every young artist, every silenced voice, every fan who never knew. Usher's words rang through the room, each one heavy with years of unspoken truth. This isn't just about Diddy, he said, his tone resolute. It's about a system that told kids like me to stay quiet, to smile, to be grateful for abuse disguised as opportunity. I'm doing this for the ones who didn't make it out. The weight of his statement settled over everyone in the courtroom, but its reach extended far beyond that moment. Usher wasn't just testifying for himself anymore, he was speaking for countless others who had been trapped in the same cycle of manipulation and control, forced to endure it in silence, and often pushed aside when they tried to speak out. A collective reckoning had begun. What had started as a legal battle over trafficking and racketeering had evolved into something much deeper. It was no longer just about the charges against one man. It had become a moral crisis, a cultural shift, a personal story of survival, and, most importantly, a call for justice. For the first time, the silence was broken. The system that had protected predators and kept its victims silent was being exposed in front of the world. And as Usher stood there, it became clear, this was just the beginning. His testimony wasn't just about holding one person accountable, it was about dismantling an entire culture that had silenced too many for far too long. The truth had been spoken. And the world was finally listening.